Hi guys, Tom Larimer here. Today we're going to be talking about sink tip lengths for spey rods, and there's a couple of considerations to think about when you're selecting the length of your sink tip. Number one is fishing conditions. Number two is casting ability. So let's talk about the casting ability first. For most people that are an intermediate to an advanced caster, 12-foot sink tip seems to be very, very comfortable. Sometimes the conditions may dictate jumping out to a longer tip, say 15 feet, but 12 feet seems to be a nice working length for most people. And as you jump into the sort of the beginner to beginner intermediate, 12 feet gets a little tougher, especially when you're trying to get that sink tip out of the water, set the fly up for your next cast. So a 10-footer tends to be a little bit easier, or even a 9-footer if you're a real beginner, just to kind of get the hang of getting the sink tip out of the water. Now, with that said, the fishing conditions are going to dictate your sink tip length as well. And there's a couple of things to really be aware of as to how different lengths of sink tips fish in relationship to how heavy they are. So when you talk about a longer sink tip, and let's just say for round numbers is around 100 grains. So that sink tip is going to fish kind of splayed out. Now you could take a heavier sink tip in a shorter distance that is going to be the same amount of grain weight, and it's going to sink faster. So it's going to end up sinking a little bit more vertically. It's going to fish the fly more vertically. So two good examples of that, if we were to take, say, 12 feet of T10, or let's say 10 feet of T10, so that's 100 grains of sink tip, and then we took 7.5 feet of T14, these two tips are going to fish very differently. Even though they're about the same grain weight, this is a heavier sink tip, it's a faster density, so it's going to end up fishing a little bit more vertical. So this should be a great sink tip when you're trying to fish, say, over the top of a boulder garden, or in high water conditions where the fish are really, really shallow. You need to get the fly down, but you don't want it tracking super, super deep. Having that fly kind of hang vertically, that's going to fish really, really well for you. On the other hand, if you have conditions where the fish are out deeper, they're not tight up against the bank, you want to get that fly tracking in a nice long deep swing, a longer sink tip is going to fish better. And interesting enough, if you take two sink tips, let's say 100 grains each, one is 7 feet long and one is 10 feet long, ultimately the 10-footer will get deeper. Even though the density is less, or the sink rate is less, it will track deeper, but it will take longer to get to that depth. And so that's a consideration when you're out there fishing. And one of the big mistakes I see a lot of very good steelheaders make is they just simply don't change their sink tip enough. They're hanging up, the fly is constantly in the rocks, and the steelhead are not living in the rocks. They're not bonefish, they're not going to tail to the fly. You want the fly above the fish, not very far above the fish, but you definitely don't want to be snagging up on every cast. So if you're one of those people who believes if you're not losing flies, you're not fishing, you're missing a lot of opportunities out there. So at any rate, just a couple things to think about next time you're out there sink tip fishing. A shorter, heavier tip is going to fish more vertical, good for rock gardens or fishing soft inside. A longer tip that's going to splay out a little bit longer is better for a longer, deeper swing when the fish are sitting out in the deeper troughs.